The fight or flight mechanism is not itself intelligent. It's a form of memory, but see, the memory with the fight or flight is really just the neurological patterns themselves. So imagine an animal is seeing another animal during a fight or flight. The pattern of that animal, the smells, the sounds, it's getting recorded in another area of the brain where the efferent neurons and afferent neurons are what compose the mechanism of the fight or flight system, is something separate from the normal cognitive processes of the brain. Imagine the brain, and then imagine all the functions of the brain and everything that the brain does. Every emotion you feel, every pattern you see will have a correlating pattern that is actually neurological activity. This neurological activity is what the fight or flight captures. It captures it kind of like a computer program. And so if you're looking at an animal, looking at something during its first fight or flight, it's like my security camera right here. It captures it. Okay. But what it's capturing is with its sensors, the afferent neurons or sensory neurons in the brain. And all they're doing is detecting the patterns that are present during this event. You see, those patterns will be later activated again. And so when this particular pattern or certain threshold of patterns, like certain frequencies of sounds, like for example, if a rabbit runs away from a hawk, well, the wings of the hawk, the sounds, the smells, anything associated with this experience will trigger the rabbit to have a fight or flight later. But you see, also what's triggered are the unique behaviors because you think the animal survived. And so imagine this form of memory is literally saving different patterns, whether it's patterns in the cerebellum, cerebral cortex, emotional relationships to this event. And so this experience is captured not just within the memory of the animal. Separate from the memory is where the fight or flight exists. See, this is an important thing to know in psychology. You see, psychology thinks that a lot of your traumas are stored in the memories themselves. And what we see in transformation, that's not true. That if you have a particular pattern happening, like your triggers exist independently of reality. They're triggered into existence, meaning the feeling of not good enough or abandonment or guilt. These patterns often have nothing to do with reality, but when the emotions arise within you, emotions are what gives context to reality. So you ever notice like a guilt trip, you feel guilty and it's really profound, yet your consciousness recognizes this isn't something you should feel guilty about. And so you become defensive, offended, like somebody's making you feel guilty. Well, of course, you attribute this experience to what's happening, but the truth is the pattern exists independently of what's happening. It just gets triggered by certain patterns, like a level of volume can make you feel like you're freezing or stuck. Somebody getting mad can automatically cause you to think that there's something wrong. Something's wrong with me. What did I do wrong? The what did I do wrong is a response to the fear, a response to guilt, a response to emotions that are arising from a circumstance. But you see, what happens with the fight or flight in humans is the patterns get tangled. How they get tangled is that in a normal fight or flight, you have an external pattern, let's just say the fox. That causes a emotion and a behavior. And so the emotion and the behavior get recorded as behavioral responses. And so now what happens in the future is that the animal will have a much faster response rate because that same pattern will now be captured by the same signals. So the afferent neurons are going to detect the presence of this pattern, and they're going to create the same emotional experience and behavioral paradigms that were originally created as the animal figured it out. You see, for the animal to really understand what's going on, there's some cognitions associated with interpretation. Well, this bifurcates the need for interpretation. That's why you can get guilt tripped without interpretation. That's why a lot of your emotional reactions and responses don't make a lot of sense to you. Like, why would you feel abandoned if you got discarded by a narcissist. Well, this is why. Because the separation anxiety when you were 5 years old is being recreated. And it tells you that you're unsafe. It tells you that you're helpless. It tells you that you're not enough. It tells you that you need help. You see, the not enough feeling, the not good enough that we interpret as personal deficiency, is actually the emotions of flight. You see, the fight or flight sizes up opponents in nature. And so the animal doesn't automatically feel not enough because, let's say, my dog sees a possum. He's going to act aggressive. But if my dog sees a lion, well, the not good enough is what makes him run away. You see, I'm not good enough is just a vocalization of a sense of smallness or deficiency that's normal within the fight or flight. But human beings get stuck. The reason we get stuck is that me, you see, me was a human construct that enabled us to experience ourselves independently of the reality. Now, I want you to understand something about that. Experiencing yourself as something separate from the world may seem like a sign of intelligence, but you see, in my book, I detail why this is a problem. Because the emotions that animals feel never have anything to do with the animal itself. The emotions are experienced by the animal. Like the animal can feel sad, it can feel happy, it could feel pleasure, it could feel comfort, it could feel peace, it could feel pain, it could feel grief, it could feel profound fear, it could feel abandoned. But you see, these emotions have practical purposes in helping the animal navigate and understand its world accurately. You see, humans' emotions lost their accuracy because what happened is that the child at the age of 5 has already discovered me as something separate from out there. But what we fail to realize is out there is already in here. What does that mean it's already in here? Well, your eyes, your ears are capturing a three-dimensional world. That three-dimensional world was meant to cause emotions to define the world. Emotions were meant to define our relationship to the world. But you see, humans are the only species with emotions that define the relationship between ourself to ourself. That you're feeling sad because you're abandoned. You're feeling worthless because you're broken. You're feeling not good enough because you're abandoned. And so one leads to the other and leads to the other. And so we get stuck because these patterns overlap. And what does that mean, overlap? Well, you see, when the animal first has a fight or flight, it's 2 stages. The first stage is arousal and a broad awareness, a scanning of the landscape. You see, a rabbit is sleeping. A rabbit can be woken by the rustling of leaves or hearing a fox sniffing around. It's hiding, the rabbit, while it sleeps, and then it gets woken up. Uh-oh. It has ears and eyes, and now it's looking. What is the sound? Somewhere over there could be a rabbit or a fox hiding. And so it has to be hypervigilant in its assessment of what's going on. It has to have a very broad awareness so it can locate the exact sound. You see, the broad awareness is expanding the consciousness to envelop all the sensory information for the purpose of detecting wherever this came from. The moment it's located, the consciousness involuntarily collapses to envelop that location, that animal, that threat. And the rest of the reality gets blocked. It gets blocked so that other elements that are unrelated to survival do not trigger behaviors that would compete with the need for the animal to run or fight. So the fight or flight subordinates and blocks all other emotions. It does so through cognitive impairments. This leads to dissociation and dissociative disorders in human beings. This leads to confusion. Confusion is not a function of brain power, but it's a function of brain impairment, where the fear causes the discontinuity of cognitive ability, meaning your brain is processing information, but you don't see it. You see, when the rabbit has a fight or flight to the fox, its nose gets every odor in the environment. See, the nose just has sensors, so do the eyes and ears. And so the sensors respond to sensory stimuli, and the animal does not control that process. That process results in the cerebral cortex processing that information. But that information is processed based on its utility for survival in the moment. You see, that causes humans fixations because you see, all of our attachments in life have to do with fight or flight reactions. Like rejection, for example, is a fight or flight reaction. You're approaching a woman as if you're approaching a lion, you're afraid of her. And you arbitrarily now need some confirmation to contest the potential of rejection, which would be getting a phone number, getting her to make out with you, or getting interest. And so while you act out being nice, you're really scared and nervous. You're trying to be perfect, which is what you always do, trying to put your best foot forward. And so in the face of life, the way that you deal with your fear is a behavioral dynamic that you invented. You see, at 5, something happened in your life. Something. Now, right now, that something is a conflated story, a dramatization that includes all these emotions. But you see, all those emotions were about you. You see, that's not what emotions were for. What happened is that once the fight or flight hits a child, it creates a universal sense of something's wrong here, just like it does with animals. You see, so animals scanned the outside world, but you scanned me. So when you started scanning me, you started overlapping what you felt inside of me as the cause. Meaning that rather than having an external thing cause you to feel afraid and abandoned, you just felt afraid and abandoned and thought that the being abandoned was a real experience. And then it escalated more fear. And it kept going until full dissociation. That's where broken comes from. That's where confused comes from. That's where stuck comes from. That's where helpless, powerless, weak. That's where failure. That's where unworthy. That's where worthless. Every single trigger in the human genome was created by a malformation where the observed reality within you caused the reserved reality. So what you're observing inside yourself was caused by the fight or flight. And as you observed, you escalated the fear until you fully disconnected. This required you to analyze and go, I got to figure this out. And you also improperly put your parents and caregivers into this effect where they became predators to you. They became people that you were afraid of abandoning you. But abandonment and disappointment is now framed with the fear of death. People fear failure like they fear death, simply because it's trapped in the fight or flight mechanism. And so your paralyzing fear of rejection, your paralyzing fear of being judged, of not belonging, of not passing your tests, of failing, of having your bills get behind, all your fears that define you only do so because they trigger these emotions. These emotions are what define you, but they're involuntary. Have you noticed that? That people want to believe it's limiting beliefs. If it was just a belief, then change your belief. In a world where somebody could just believe something, well, you can't change these beliefs. See, what you're trying to do is counter them. You're trying to believe in yourself to try to convince yourself. You're trying to invent future fantasies that give you hope of overcoming these projected deficiencies, which are just triggers. That's why my coaching methods work 100%. Is they address these psychoneurological dynamics that if you let go of being broken, the cognitive impairment it induces and the fear disappears in the moment. By the time you let go of all the triggers, you will be in a Zen-like state called everything nothing. You see, why this works is that it works on the same principles as meditation. We are turning off the fight or flight switches by identifying the malformations of the mind. That my coaching methods is just an advancement of the transformational processes I've experienced. The only difference is I discovered the single moment cause. And that's for everyone would be 5 to 6 to 4, somewhere in that range. Whereas narcissist is 1.5, 2 to the max. It just happens to capture the emotionality of young babies. And that takes away their empathy because they have an unknown origin for all their fear. They live lives feeling abandoned and deficient all the time. They live lives of envy. They live lives of emulating behaviors of others in a world where they never had real empathy. But you see, even normal people lack empathy because their normal emotions are obliterated, so they do not properly understand other people. Because if they did, then they would not be entangled with narcissists and predators. And so just consider something, that psychology, as advanced as it is, has been looking through its own kaleidoscope of something's wrong with me in an effort to fix the entire human experience and has in doing such made it permanent. That the subconscious holds the total sum of your higher self, all your higher functions. I am saying to you that you may have true genius within you. You may have a creative capacity within you that is ungodly, that is absolutely outside the boundaries of what you can understand. I know because I have that. My suffering now in my life is a direct result of invisibility and negation in a world that does not ever want to hear what I'm saying. What I'm saying is so true that people can't handle the simplicity of the fact that I can cause transformation in minutes, and anybody can. But you see, it's like inventing a telescope and having everyone believe the earth is flat. That understanding and having an attachment to knowledge is something that you do to protect yourself because you have a yellow brick road to a future where you're fixed, a future where you're healed, a future where you're good enough, a future where you're loved. But all the unloved feelings, they're not real. They're real feelings, but it's a pathological malformation where the cause and the effect are the same. And so it stimulates itself, that the experience of not enough stimulates more not enough. The experience of sadness stimulates something's wrong and stimulates sadness. And so it creates prolonged grieving. It creates rumination. The cognitive impairment of being this way since 5 forces people to analyze reality in a slow, methodical, nonsensical, fear-based confusion that's unnecessary when your mind is working because it would generate an automatic understanding. And your imagination would wake up and no longer be a viewing lens for your past or your problems, that there would be no more problems, that the problems do not exist in animals. Animals do not have trauma. An animal that gets away from a cheetah is not traumatized by the experience, that they reach the maximum amount of fear to run away. So the fight or flight is only temporary. They do not have repetitive reactions. They have appropriate reactions, and they need to run away and be afraid. And so they don't have a malformation because they don't define themselves based on things that happen. They don't consider themselves. So they don't feel rejection, otherwise they wouldn't reproduce. They don't feel traumatized. They feel fear, and that's normal because that's what causes them to survive. So in humans, we have repetitive, recycling experiences that are pervasive, that are lifelong, and that create all human suffering and create the basis of all attachments to outcomes. That you need success to overcome the feeling of not enough, so that you could belong, so that you could avoid rejection, so that you could avoid abandonment. That you're looking for other people to help complete the picture of your life because you improperly experience these phenomenal emotions that contextualize your entire reality. A reality that says you need to be good enough someday, perfect, a distant future, contingent upon some outcome, some effort that you've got to lay forth in order to finally reach the peace of mind and happiness that you want so badly, but can never seem to arrive at consistently. Given that's the whole of humanity, that's why it's so universal. And that's why it's universal imperative of me to make sure people understand that there's freedom right there within minutes. And there's medical treatments that can then help cure things like NPD, schizophrenia, psychopathy. And people like borderlines are one conversation away from total freedom, provided that they actually have that disorder and not something like NPD, which is often confused since they categorize these together totally improperly due to a non-understanding of the neurological realities that cause mental illness. That it's not just psychological, that you can't explain dissociation just by thinking it's an evasion to fear, when no, dissociation is caused by the fear. Dissociation is caused by the cognitive inhibitions that norepinephrine induces in animals, in a human mind that's already contaminated by norepinephrine since childhood. And so we've just normalized the anxiety that dominates all of us, and it's driving humanity off a cliff.